Thanks very much for being here for our second session of today, which is going to look at regional approaches to post-conflict stability and reconstruction. Regional rivalries, especially between Iran and Gulf Arab states, have exacerbated the conflict in Yemen and raised the risk that their strategic and security goals will unduly influence reconstruction to the detriment of the Yemenis themselves. So how do Yemen's neighbors translate their security and economic interests in the country into an investment in its post-conflict reconstruction that promotes stability and benefits all of Yemen's citizens, communities, and geographic regions equally? And what are the roles that great powers like the United States and multilateral institutions such as the UN and its various agencies will play in making all of that possible and bringing meaningful post-conflict stabilization and reconstruction to Yemen? And so with that in mind, we have a terrific panel for you. To my immediate left is Mohammed Baharoon, who's the Director General of Bahuth, the Dubai Public Policy Research Center. Right next to him is the Honorable Denise Natali, another old friend, who is the Assistant Secretary of State at the Bureau of Conflict Stabilization Operations, and we're very grateful to you for coming today. And finally, at the end here is Lise Grande, who is the United Nations Humanitarian Coordinator in Yemen. And it's great to meet you after having read so much about your work and having written about it as well. So I think I'd like to start just by getting an overview on what sort of priority, what post-conflict stabilization and reconstruction would look like from your perspectives, your institutional or geographical national perspectives. And I think we'll begin with, at the beginning of our row here, with the biggest possible overview from Lise, from a United Nations point of view, and then we'll move closer in. So I'll begin with you. I think the microphone is on, so please go right ahead and try to describe how the work that you are set up to do can be a pivotal role in the post-conflict reconstruction and stabilization in Yemen.
Doctor, thank you very much. It's an honor to be with all of the colleagues on the panel. If you allow me, perhaps I can share a few observations about the UN's experience in stabilization more broadly. Stabilization is an area of UN endeavor where the track record is not particularly strong. What that means is that we have, in many countries, tried to do stabilization, and in many countries, we have not done it as effectively as member states or people expect us to. So if you look at the UN's track record in humanitarian assistance, it's very strong. You look at the UN's track record in peace mediation, it's strong. You look at the UN's track record in disarmament, climate change, some of the very big multilateral issues, it's good. You look at the UN's track record in stabilization, it's highly variable. Now the UN's aware of this, and we've, in the last several years, asked ourselves some very important, at times uncomfortable and difficult questions about why the track record isn't better. And what do we have to do in contexts like Yemen to be effective? So distilling a whole lot of lessons learned down into a few key points, the UN is increasingly convinced that stabilization has to do the following. Above all, it has to be fast. Any stabilization activities or initiatives that take a long time don't develop the kind of momentum that's necessary when you're in a post-conflict situation. Point number two, stabilization has to be simple. If you look to stabilization to rebuild the justice system, you're in the wrong lane. If you look to stabilization to rebuild governance capacity, you're in the wrong lane. And so stabilization work has to be very fast, it has to be very simple. The second key point is that stabilization requires sequencing of priorities. This is tough. What do you do first? Right? Because if you make a decision to try and do everything, you'll get nothing done. Frustration will build, insurgency will grow, and you'll end up back in the mess we all just tried to get out of. So the question of what activities you do first is always a judgment question. It's not only just about what's important, it's about what you can have impact in. So for example, when Tim was talking in the last session about the importance of security sector reform, that's absolutely the bedrock and the foundation for any successful post-conflict dispensation in Yemen. The issue in stabilization is which parts of security sector reform can we have impact in the fastest. And then from the UN's experience, the fourth critical point is that the programs which are done under stabilization have to have impact, and this is a segue into the point that we just raised. If you are embarked on a stabilization program and there's not a chance that there's going to be impact in doing it, then don't do it. There has to be a difference that's demonstrable and concrete. Things have to be fast, sequenced, simple, and they have to have a demonstrable impact. In terms of how the UN is thinking about stabilization for Yemen, there are a couple of points that we're coalescing around. Point number one, as soon as there is an agreement with the parties on what should happen, the government has to function effectively very quickly. Now, that doesn't mean all parts of the government have to function effectively in all domains. But at a minimum, the following needs to happen. Got to be a national budget. Right? That budget has to make sure that there is sufficient funding for the things that matter the most. Policing functions, the social protection floor, and the parts of the government that carry out the main requirements for the management of the economy. If we have a national budget that takes 90% of resources and puts it into the long-term development of the economic base, it's a dumb budget. Now, a lot of work on that budget can already happen now. You don't have to wait for a peace deal. That work can happen immediately. Second key point on helping the government to function effectively, get the payroll clean. There's a 2014 pre-conflict payroll. During the conflict, a whole lot of people, probably hundreds of thousands of people, have been added to the new payroll. That raises very difficult, very uncomfortable questions about whether those people should be on that payroll. Well, one thing that can be done effectively and done right now is to take the original 2014 payroll and get it verified. So as soon as there's a deal, you can start to have the people who need to run the ministries effectively moving forward. The third thing that we have to do, and this is already a point, again, Tim raised it in the last session, is to unify the central bank and make sure that there is a monetary architecture in place to manage the economy. Right now, there isn't. That's why the country is on the brink of famine. I know colleagues are aware of this. Starting in September, there was the uncontrolled, rapid depreciation of the real that literally brought the country to the brink of famine. The responsible and capable management of monetary policy would have prevented that. The Quad, which Ambassador Shesh raised, has been instrumental in helping to roll that back, and thank goodness for it. Again, as soon as we get a peace deal, the reunification of the central bank has to be one of the top priorities. And then linked to this is identifying the parts of the revenue base that can start to generate national income the fastest. So if we are looking at the complete revitalization of the gas and oil sector, that's a 10-year project. That doesn't make sense for stabilization. But the reform of parts of the customs apparatus to make sure that revenue which comes in from the ports is collected and used as a form of national income makes sense. Second key point on stabilization, in addition to making sure that the government operates effectively, is to demonstrate to the people that their lives are better. Again, a key point that came up several times in the previous panel. There are ways that you can do this pretty effectively and pretty quickly. Number one, put a lot of people to work on public work schemes. Not hundreds of people in slow-moving livelihood strategies. I know everybody knows this, but typically, if you do a livelihood program, you know how long it takes to create a job? 4 years. It takes 4 years on average. Every time I hear about livelihood programs, I have to tell you, my eyes just go, oh, right, you're looking at 4 years before you get a job on the ground. In a context like Yemen, where there are 10 million people right now that can't afford the food they need in order to survive, that just doesn't make any sense. What you want are public works programs that put hundreds of thousands of people to work immediately. Second key point is getting the grids up and functioning. Make sure the lights work, water work, and sanitation systems work. In order to do that, typically if you're involved in a reconstruction program, I know everybody knows this, you start at the top of the grid, you work your way down. Anyone who did Iraq in 2003, 4, 5, and 6, started at the top of the grid, electricity. People sat in Ramadi for 2 years before there was an electrical connection to their homes. 2 years where insurgent forces came and dug in and won the loyalty of populations who were tired of a government and occupation forces that couldn't get the lights on. So how do you avoid that? You start at the bottom of the grid. You make sure that the first part of the grid that you repair are the household connections. You do the same with the water system and the same with the sanitation system. Very critically linked to this is the thing that every single family in Yemen says they want. You ask them, and at the top of their list, and it doesn't matter what part of the country you're in, they all say one thing: we want our kids in school. All right, so the first thing you do is get the kids in school. And then linked very closely to that, of course, is making sure that in every single district, that district hospital is open, clean, and providing life-saving services. One of the mistakes we made on the humanitarian side in Yemen, you know, humanitarians, when they go into a country, they always focus on the primary health care system. What tends to happen in Yemen is that the services are so bad at the primary health care level that families will literally go into debt to get money, to take a taxi so that they can get to the district hospital because that's where services are predictable and of the highest quality. All right, so you go into the district level and you repair those hospitals, and you've just told everyone in the country, government cares for you and you're going to get the best health care possible. Related to all of this is the question of the 2 million people who are still displaced. They got to go home. Right? Nothing signals that a country is finished with war than people going home. All right, and that's something which is linked to the services that are provided, the jobs that are there for them, demining the areas that are infested and contaminated by unexploded ordnance. Now, the final point on this set of issues has to do with the social protection floor. Yemen had, before the war, one of the most extensive and advanced social protection floors in the region. It was cash-based, it was a cash transfer program. It has continued to exist during the conflict because the World Bank, it's the first time they've ever done this, they've given funding that would have gone to the government to the UN agencies, and we've kept the social protection floor in place. The massive scaling up of that could be the difference between people going home and people staying in displacement. If I can then talk about the final set of issues, it's the most sensitive one, and it has to do with ensuring that there are pragmatic security arrangements in place. I'm going to say that word again, pragmatic. With multiple security forces, many of which are under weak or non-existent command and control, the issues of disarmament and the reorganization of security forces is going to be a nightmare. Right? There's just no other way to classify it. So, however we address this collectively, however the Yemenis address it, for the stabilization phase, the key is to make sure that whatever arrangements are in place are practical. That means that if the National Police Force isn't ready to take over, and forces which currently are handling law and order functions stay for a period of time, we have to be prepared to have that discussion and look at that sequencing. This is the messiest part of anything that we're going to be doing. I want to say one final word. Most stabilization programs, if you look at the literature and the track record, most stabilization programs fail to address the devil in the room. And the devil in the room are the areas where insurgency can spread quickly, if not dealt with immediately. So any stabilization effort has to have a set of activities that focus on the areas where insurgent forces are gaining ground, not just where they are, but where they are gaining ground. And as part of a collective stabilization approach, have clear-sighted programs aimed at stopping that spread.
Wow, terrific. Thank you very much. Denise, how does it look from the State Department's perspective?
Thank you, Dr. Ibish. Thank you very much. It's good to see you again, and thank you, Ambassador, and the Gulf States Institute for the invitation to be here, and with my distinguished panelists. Similar to what Lise just discussed about some of the difficulties or challenges in approaching stabilization in the past, so we too have had our own sets of challenges and failures looking at Afghanistan and Iraq and other areas. And this is where I'd like to talk about our approach based on the Stabilization Assistance Review, otherwise known as the SAR. And the SAR is the blueprint or the framework in which the State Department, and my Bureau in particular, will be and continues to address stabilization operations in general and in Yemen in particular. Let me go back a bit and say that one of the things that started was a very clear definition of what stabilization is, much of which overlaps with what was just discussed, which is stabilization is essentially a political endeavor that creates conditions in which local legitimate actors and structures can manage conflict and prevent a return to violence. It's limited in scope. Stabilization is not humanitarian assistance or reconstruction. It is not open-ended. Therefore, we look at this as a short-term, possibly 1 to 5 years, but nonetheless a short-term operation. There are 3 main tenets to the SAR, to the Stabilization Assistance Review, that provide, again, similar approach to targeting stabilization, making sure that stabilization is linked to very clear political outcomes, and the third part is burden sharing, having not only a whole-of-government approach within our government, but across international partners as well. I'll comment a little bit on each 3 so we can get a better idea. And again, this approach is what 3 entities in the U.S. government, that is the State Department's Bureau of Conflict and Stabilization Operations with our Foreign Assistance Bureau, USAID, and the Department of Defense. This is a joint product that have come together to address some of our challenges in the past, and it agrees that the State Department will take the lead in stabilization. USAID will take the lead as the key implementing organization for non-security assistance, and DoD will be a supporting partner in this, which is a difference moving forward. The first part, the first tenet of this is that our stabilization, we found that to be successful, needs to be linked to a very clear political outcome. Not only what are our interests, so that we talked about what is our outcome of a peace negotiation in Yemen. Once we identify this requires what? Clear analysis and preparation beforehand. There's a lot of investment put in before. Identifying who those local actors are, what our regional partners' interests are, what are the assumptions, and continuing a continuous and iterative process of monitoring these outcomes along the way. Are we actually targeting our political outcomes? So without that, you have a less likely chance of success or moving forward. The second part of targeted assistance, we talked about again, that also touches upon sequencing. This is not anymore the days where we can look at something and let's say we're going to stabilize the whole country and start throwing a lot of money in places where not only can we potentially destabilize the local economy by throwing in money into places, but finding where specifically there are A, local partners, B, or it should be very important, is the security situation. Without security in locations, then you're unlikely to have a modicum of success. Or to put it better, successful stabilization is linked to security conditions. Within this component of finding available local partners, what does this mean? It means that stabilization is going to happen in piecemeal. We will have pockets of peace, islands of stability. We've seen this happening in Iraq. We've seen this in Syria. You can see this in Libya. where you can have stabilization, where you can have security, and then hope that there will be a movement toward other areas as well. The third part of our approach to stabilization is burden sharing. And that is not only within, there's an internal component to that. That is whole of government across the interagency. Let's find out who is doing what, not only so that we're not duplicating, but that we can enhance the capabilities of each group. Across our international partnerships, CSO is part of what's called the Stabilization Leaders Forum, in which we work with our counterparts internationally. There are 8 member states, so that we can divide that labor as well. The UK Stabilization Unit is one of them, for example. So that, again, we can coordinate not only internally, but across international partners, with the United Nations, with the World Bank. So in each of these cases, we're looking at a more targeted stabilization policy. We're looking at ways in which we are linking what we're doing to clear political outcomes. This also means that we're going to hold our local partners accountable. What part of this is local stakeholders contributing and not contributing, and then adjusting along the way our policy moving forward. Thank you.
Oh, that's great. And Mohammed, if I can ask you what the same set of conundrums look like from the point of view of the UAE's goals and strategic requirements and its role in Yemen as well.
Thank you very much, Hussein. And again, thank you very much for the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington for focusing on the day after in Yemen. And even though that today is happening as Stockholm is going on, but again, this is something that the Arab Gulf States Institute has been doing for quite a while. And they've done a number of workshops focusing on post-conflict in Yemen. I would try and link to what has been discussed from the global level and the US level to what the UAE has been doing in Yemen. But before that, I would like to have a small comment on the very important issue that you started with, which is the concept of rivalry between Saudi Arabia and Iran, and how does that imply. And I think that there's a sort of a misrepresentation here. I don't think that there's a real rivalry between Saudi Arabia and Iran in Yemen. One, Saudi has got borders with Yemen. Iran does not have borders with Yemen. Saudi has got an actual threat to its national security from groups who are looping missiles in Saudi Arabia, groups who are saying that we will march all the way to Mecca. There is no groups in Yemen saying we'll march all the way to Mashhad. No one is looping, missiles. So strategically, if you look at Yemen from the point of view of Saudi, UAE, and the coalition, stabilizing Yemen is important to stabilizing Saudi Arabia. So that is an inherent important aspect. Iran would not be much interested in stabilizing Yemen because basically it does not gain much out of it. It plays that spoiler role. Now, to look at that important commitment to stabilization in Yemen, it started before the war. I mean, the GCC initiative in Yemen precedes the war. And again, until today, even as people are discussing peace in Stockholm, this is one of those founding documents that people are looking back to as one of the references of how peace can be established. If we would take an example of, for instance, what the UAE has been doing, let's say in a place like Mukalla or Hadramaut, where they have turned Qaeda away from Mukalla, stabilization was basically focused exactly on that. One, create a sort of legitimacy. So the forces that are driving Al-Qaeda out also are wearing badges. They have their structure. They create a legitimacy. They focus on issues like providing infrastructures. So we've got works where actually people are working. That's public work, where people are working, their job created. They're working on electricity provision. Again, that is an important aspect of normalizing life. Even some of those infrastructure projects had to do with entertainment. So there are areas in Mukalla that has been restructured again as a recreational place, which means that we need to get life back to normal. And that's a very important aspect. And it's definitely, that's one pocket of peace. You cannot look at all of Yemen and say, I will achieve peace and stabilization everywhere. But stabilization is also contagious. In the same way, you know, a disruption is also contagious. And if you've got a very good example somewhere, you can do the same thing. Now, if you look at what is the gains, or if we look at the importance of stabilizing Yemen because of national security, either in Saudi or in the entire Gulf, we would also have to look at what does Yemen represent? And again, how can it contribute? Yemen is actually the gateway for the Arabian Peninsula to the Indian Ocean. That's a very important aspect to Saudi, to UAE, to Oman, and all the way up to Bahrain and others. So that is a huge value. Now, the GCC countries do not see themselves as part of the 6 nations who are only overlooking the Arabian Gulf. They see themselves as part of the Arabian Peninsula that looks at the Arabian Gulf, it looks at the Arabian Sea, it looks at the Red Sea, and all the way up to the Mediterranean. These are 4 important seas, and Yemen is an important part of that. So if you're looking at the future of Yemen, of post-conflict, you also have to take in consideration the value that Yemen can bring to this whole structure. And in that case, securing not only regions in Yemen, but also securing Yemen's main revenue, how that revenue is going to come, which is an important aspect of the whole coastline to the Arabian Sea and the Indian Ocean. That means that Yemen is going to be important to India, it's going to be important to China, it's going to be important to Japan. And that way I'm creating new partnerships in the future of Yemen and in the stability of Yemen. Again, stability is something that you could do for a short period of time, but there has to be a sustainability for that. And that sustainability will not be achieved unless we have the ability to make Yemen valuable for other nations, either within this region or outside the region. If you look at the Horn of Africa, if you look at the Red Sea, these are an important tradeways all the way to Europe and beyond. And Yemen can play an important aspect in that security. And that's why Iran was focusing on the Bab al-Mandab Strait as a spoiler, in the same way Hormuz Strait was a spoiler. If we understand that type of dynamics, we would see that there's an important area, an important dividends that the GCC countries will receive, and the world as well will receive from stabilizing Yemen. So burden sharing, definitely, but the burden sharing would not be only from the region, which is have a vetted interest in stabilizing Yemen, but also from the world, not because it is a moral duty, but actually because it has an impact on trade and stability for the future. So these are the strategic approaches, if you want, to stabilization of Yemen. We stabilize Yemen, we are investing in stabilizing Yemen, not because Yemen deserves to be stable, not because of the war, but because of the value Yemen can have for the region and for the world beyond. And if we have that type of approach to how we look at Yemen, we would see that there's a bigger value in that effort.
Great, thank you very much. Lise, if I could, picking up on what both Denise and Mohammed said, most of what you described in terms of the priorities, the triage that you were sort of describing, which is basically lessons learned from previous major humanitarian efforts, post-conflict stabilization efforts, and it was really very, very instructive and interesting. But it was framed in national terms. It was framed in broad terms. But I think both Denise and Mohammed have pointed out that in Yemen, it's that in any situation, you're likely to be dealing with in pockets of stability before broader areas. And in the case of Yemen, it's hard to imagine an integrated national solution to big picture issues at an early stage. It's surely likely to be discrete, fragmentary. And so how would the UN efforts respond to that wrinkle and the work of your office? How do you conceptualize dealing with that?
When Martin Griffiths was appointed as the special envoy, one of the things that he said is to the other part of the UN, to my part of the shop, he said, don't let me down. He said, if we get an agreement by the parties to, for example, demilitarize an area, then hurry up and program it. Don't let the politicians reach an agreement and the rest of us who have to make that concrete, take a year to do a perfect project and plan it, and during that year everything falls apart politically. He said, the UN does this everywhere in the world. Don't do it to me. So, what we have done. Right. At Martin's request, the UN is establishing a Yemen Stabilization Facility. And Denise and I were talking about it last night. It's a very straightforward facility. What will happen with the facility is that the parties to the conflict with Martin will agree on an area where we create this pocket of stability. And then right away we program it, doing three things. Get people to work, get the grids up and running from the bottom up, and provide support to the local authorities at their request. So it's just as Denise was saying, it's a facility that is attached to the political goal. That goal is decided through the peace process. Our job is to support that political process by getting people home, putting people to work, getting the grids up, and supporting the local authorities. We're very grateful that there are several member states of the UN that have already stepped forward and said that they have so much confidence in what Martin's going to achieve in Stockholm with everybody that they're capitalizing the stabilization facility. We're very grateful for that. Facility is up and ready to go. It's going to be implemented by a single part of the UN. The UN has 41 agency funds and programs. If you wonder why we don't get things done all the time, that's part of the reason why. And the more you ask all of those different agency funds and programs to coordinate, the longer everything takes.
Of course.
All right, so it's going to be implemented by one part of the UN system. It's UNDP. They've got the best track record in the UN on these kinds of programs. What we're not going to do is what we do in lots of other countries, where we then, as the money comes in, implement through other UN agencies and other frontline partners. Everyone takes a big cut every step of that way. If you look at how long it takes to implement those programs, it takes this long. We're going to be working with the private sector. So all of the contracts will go to competitive bid for this. And the private sector, of course, there are lots of wins this way. Not only does the local private sector become part of the solution in their communities, they're a great stabilizing force. They're also very fast, and they're 10 times cheaper than any other form. As I said, Doctor, the facility is up and functioning. We're grateful to the member states that have already capitalized it. And as soon as Martin and all the parties agree in Stockholm, we're ready to go.
Just let me follow up on that. Is the system, the apparatus that the facility is setting up, is it designed to be infinitely flexible, to be deployable in any area whatsoever, and without any anticipation of where it might be, or? And without giving me any specifics, is there some thought already being given to that this area is likely to be one in which we can enter earlier, this one is going to be more difficult, therefore there's some contingency planning based on predictable pattern in which different places become stable more quickly or offer opportunities more quickly than others?
Certainly the facility is designed to be flexible to go wherever the parties agree it should go. That's the point about it. So if, for example, in Stockholm there was an agreement to be reached on TAWS, demilitarization of TAWS, there's already been a mapping done of the private sector capabilities in the various different sectors there. We would be able to get going pretty quickly. In Iraq, where this approach was pioneered, the UN, and I have to say no one was more surprised by this than the UN itself, could literally, from the time a project was agreed till the contractors were on the ground, it took 2 weeks. I know, no one was more surprised than us. So this is exactly the kind of approach that we would be intending for Yemen. I think there is, of course, an expectation that in Hudaida, that this terrible humanitarian crisis in Hudaida, that we address it directly. Parties agree to de-escalate, And the facility is right there to back in with this kind of support as soon as the parties would unanimously accept that there would be a de-escalation in that very critical area. I know everyone knows this, Hudaydah is disproportionately important for the economy and the life of people in northern Yemen. 90% of all of the basic commodities that people in northern Yemen require come through that port. If that port closes even for just a few days, the impact is decisive and it's immediate. That port has to stay open. Hudaydah is the lifeline for the 80% of the population in those areas. I know, again, everyone knows this. We've just finished the assessment that we do every year to determine the food security status. For the first time, that assessment was done in 330 of the 333 districts across the country. There are 10 million people right now who don't know how they're going to get their next meal. The overwhelming majority of those are in areas that is serviced by Hudaydah.
And Denise, you both, Lise and you, have emphasized the need for speed here in stabilization and reconstruction efforts. So can you tell us a bit about how your office and State Department, USAID and others, maybe even the military, sort of work to prepare for that kind of speed, that kind of quick turnaround that may make the difference between success or failure?
Thank you, Hussein. I'd step back a bit by overemphasizing speed in the sense that I'll go back to the importance of linking stabilization to our clear political outcomes, so that, in fact, before going in and engaging quickly, and I'm not talking about humanitarian assistance, which does require speed, but the stabilization strategy actually requires to step back a bit, plan strategically what are the assumptions, understanding what your regional partners or your international partners' priorities are, and planning accordingly so that you're not going in and inaccurately engaging in areas that are not ready. And I would emphasize again and again how important it is to have security apparatus in place so that you may not be as speedy in one area that may appear to be in need of stabilization, but in another where there are the local partners in place, a security apparatus in place. So how we go about doing this too, not only does our Bureau engage in advanced data analytics so that we are determining where the militias are, what are their priorities, who are reconcilable, who are not reconcilable. How can we use this information to then work with partner nations so that they know where they can target their aid? We also quickly deploy, we have a rapid deployment surge capacity at the Bureau of Conflict and Stabilization Operations, where we then put our staff out in the field, embed with embassies, and we also co-deploy with the COCOMs. We have a team out in AFRICOM right now, EUCOM and Southcom, and I'm looking to extend that so that we can continue to have that State Department, DOD relationship, yet engage in the civilian diplomatic component of stabilization while DOD provides its military support. So back to your question, yes, it becomes more integrated, and again, I'll bring back to whole of government approach, finding out who is doing what so that we're not overlapping, but we're enhancing. But the quickness, it's quickness, again, tied to very strategic calculations and a very strategic approach to how we go in and where we go in. Thank you.
So, Mohammed, two questions for you from an Emirati point of view. One, and they both flow logically from what we've heard. One is the crucial nature of getting employment in Yemen, because the humanitarian crisis is so much a function of an economic collapse more than maybe any other factor. So people just simply can't buy whatever may be potentially available. They just can't afford it. What role do you think the Gulf can play in quickly reviving employment in Yemen? And for example, is there any potential for either allowing Yemeni labor to come to Gulf countries in, with very favorable conditions, with very few restrictions, or if that's not possible from a security point of view, aggressively outsourcing economic projects to Yemen precisely in order to generate rapid employment across the board. Well, what do you think?
Now, from not a UAE perspective, but from an Arab perspective, employment or unemployment is one of those major challenges facing the entire region. And I think that possibly the reconstruction projects would, as Lisa was pointing out, would possibly provide a lot of opportunities for direct employment in Yemen. The problem is not that. The problem is that how do we sustain it beyond that period? And that means a different look at how does Yemen see itself and what can it do? A lot of people were talking about can the Houthis, for instance, benefit more from being at the seat of a weak central government in Sana'a, or they can benefit more from a very strong local government in Saada. And I think in Saada, in a strong local government with a direct economic corridor to Saudi, they will benefit far more than trying to control Hodeidah, for instance, for a weaker central government. These corridors, these economic corridors, can become sustainable. They would have an investment attraction to outer investments, not only from Saudis, but there's also a lot of Yemeni diaspora around the world who would be interested in investing there. And investment means more job opportunities. But I don't think that the creating job opportunities in Yemen would depend only on assistance from the GCC. Mm-hmm. Also, the idea of getting people to work in the GCC, looking at, for instance, the experiment in Kuwait, for instance, after the liberation of Kuwait. A lot of diaspora came from Egypt to work in Kuwait, and that has even created more problems, both for Egypt and for Kuwait. I think Yemen would need people to work inside Yemen, in the same way Syria would need Syrians to work to help Syria inside. If all of the Syrians, or capable Syrians, leave Syria, then the reconstruction, the regain of the economic cycle would be much slower. So from a strategic point of view, not from the UAE's point of view, we need to look at areas of investment inside Yemen. And there are a lot of things to consider. I mean, out of the program that we ran at Baharoon, which is Reimagining Yemen, one of the areas that we looked at was energy. There's a huge area for renewable energy. What you need is an investment in the grid that would allow Yemen to trade that type of energy. And it can go from, people who would run their own, stations, to individuals who can run solar farms in the desert. There's a lot of potential for that. But if you do not invest in the grid itself, then trading it would not be important. And the same would go to, fishery. The same would go to agriculture. There's a huge investment opportunity there. In service industry, as you did. So subcontracting or outsourcing elements is viable. But again, I think it's possibly strategically wrong to think that this is a responsibility for the GCC in Yemen. Right. This is an opportunity for the region in Yemen.
Sure. Is there a special UAE responsibility in the south of Yemen where it's been particularly active, or do you see the role as simply, a regional approach to another country?
I think the UAE has been very active in the areas of operation. To understand that driving Al-Qaeda away, for instance, from a place like Hadramaut is not in itself a win. The win is preventing them from coming back. And you cannot allow, you would not prevent them from coming back unless you created the stability that would allow people to reject that type of external. You would need to establish legitimacy. Legitimacy is not a badge. Legitimacy is working for the people. So there has been even investment done on the level of capacity building within the government level. People creating their own strategic plans for the next 3 years in the government of Hadramaut, people identifying their budgets, what they require and where. And that in itself is capacity building that's important. And it would allow people to realize One, that the government that is in place is credible, that it can actually deliver services, and that they can work with them and deal with them. And I think that is the far important investment than the just amount of money that you would pay for the, say, the power generation or even the port development. And a lot of people describe port development as a flagship. You know, it's a huge. Actually, it's not. If you develop a port, that means the people who would work in the port, people who would work in the services connected to the port, logistics, lorrying, and even the services for the people who are around it is going to increase. So it creates other businesses, and it's sustainable. It's not something that would connect to the time where I'm involved in the process.
I think people talk about it because it's something Yemen needs and something the UAE is very good at. So that it seems to,
That's an experience that
right.
we're trying to benefit.
So, Lise, we're sitting here talking about these twin projects, and I think Denise introduced a very important distinction between the humanitarian efforts and stabilization efforts that we sort of folded into the same category. But your point is very well taken, that there are different timetables and really different things in many ways that are complementary. So on both fronts, what would your office need to see coming out of Stockholm? What would trigger a major increase in your ability to provide humanitarian relief, to coordinate humanitarian efforts on a much bigger scale? And then what would you be looking for to signal the beginning of a new phase in stabilization efforts as well? And what are the conditions that you would require for that?
There's no other country in the world where 80% of the entire population needs humanitarian assistance in order to survive. Yemen does. A population of 29 million. The UN has just issued a global appeal, and the Yemen section of the humanitarian global appeal says that 22 million people in Yemen are going to need aid this year. The humanitarian operation in the country is the largest in the world, and as colleagues in the first session emphasized, it is, in the UN's view, the worst crisis globally. Every single month, heroic frontline partners and the UN are delivering food assistance and other forms of life-saving aid to 8 million people. The assessments that have just been concluded, they're decisive, they're conclusive. There's no question we have to reach another 4 million each month. In order for us to scale up from reaching 8 million, which has taken absolutely everything we have to do that, we're going to have to find a way to reach another 4 million people. So the UN has said, okay, we're going to try. That will require that our entire logistics framework be expanded dramatically, new entry points opened up. The sheer volume of what we're talking about will require a step change in our logistics capability. We're going to need money. The Emergency Relief Coordinator for the UN, Mark Lowcock, has just been in Yemen, and he has announced to the world only this week that $4 billion will be required for Yemen for the next year. That's just the humanitarian assistance program. That's not only feeding 12 million people every single month, it's providing health care, stopping cholera, helping kids to stay in school, looking after those water and sanitation systems, and providing emergency assistance to people who are going to die if we don't do it. The number of frontline partners that we have in Yemen is proportionally the smallest in the world. I often, to put this into context, say the following. This is the worst crisis in the world. It's the largest humanitarian operation. We have the thinnest evidence base and the fewest partners. There are only 164 international UN staff in the whole country. Just put this into perspective, the World Food Program in South Sudan delivering a third of the amount of food that's delivered in Yemen. One of their departments, the one that does statistical analysis, has 150 staff in it. We have 160 for the whole of Yemen. So the pressure on us to deliver at the scale that's required is absolutely, absolutely enormous. And I do want to say something about how we're able to do that, because it's unlike any other operation. You know, typically what happens in a humanitarian operation is that state structures aren't delivering. So what humanitarians do is we rush in and we create parallel structures. Parallel health systems, parallel education systems, parallel this, parallel that, parallel the other. The war ends, and then we all go, oh my gosh, we have to re-internalize all of these systems that are parallel. And it takes us forever to do it, and we do it very badly. I also have to say something else about humanitarian assistance. All these parallel systems, kid you not, they are grossly inefficient in value for money and in reach. They cost a whole lot of money, and in terms of value for money, the argument isn't there. But we do it in every operation in the world, God bless us. Now, in the case of Yemen, we haven't done it. There are not that many parallel systems that have been established, and the reason is because the World Bank took its eye to financing and gave it to the UN agencies and said implement through state systems, through the Ministry of Water, through the Ministry of Education, through the Ministry of Health. You have massive reach, huge value for money, and we've propped up those institutions. It's not a perfect system. Believe me, systems are collapsing. But that being said, this is a very important model with very important implications. It also means that when we get to the recovery phase, that the problem we face everywhere else of having to re-internalize functions for the state that have been outsourced, we don't have to do that at the same scale as we would have to in any other place. And I think this is part of the reason why there is an expectation that stabilization and recovery can be accelerated in Yemen in a way that it can't be other locations. Now, what we've asked for in Stockholm on the humanitarian side is access, stop interfering with our programs. We're saying this to all the parties. All right, let us do our assessments, let us choose our partners, remove all the restrictions on us, let us get through checkpoints, let us deliver what we need to do, stop interfering, start supporting, give us access, and we're desperate for money.
Okay, that's great. And with that, I think you have to. I think you have to go. So we're going to continue the panel, but Lise has got to go a little bit early. So I'm going to continue on by asking Denise a related question, which is, with regard to how do you see the relationship between your own efforts and the efforts of the U.S. government in general in Yemen regarding both humanitarian and especially stabilization efforts, and the negotiations in Stockholm, or the peace process in general? Is your work almost entirely or not at all or somewhat dependent on the outcome of the negotiations? And what's the relationship, in a sense, between the diplomatic track and your own efforts?
Thank you, Hussein.
Sure.
Stabilization is not an afterthought. So even though the negotiations are going on, we're not going to start the stabilization planning and initiatives until we find out what the outcome is going to be.
Right.
That's one part of it. The second part of it is our team as well has had value added or engaged in supporting Griffith in the negotiation process. There's actually modelings that you do across the world in negotiations and leveraging. So we've been supporting Special Envoy Griffiths from the outset, and then linking whatever those outcomes are to where we would engage in stabilization. So if we know, for example, that we have, again, I'm going to go back to the SAR, what are the requisites in place that we know that we can, where we can work effectively, and we'll go to these particular subnational areas, or we'll work with those subnational, locally legitimate groups. There may just be one or two areas that will do it. Second part of it is working in tandem. It's not the case in Yemen per se, but I'll say in general, with the military, so that if let me take Syria or any other place where there's military operations, the stabilization planning needs to be starting even before a negotiated peace process is ending. It should be when the military campaign is going on, so that we're filling in that gap between when the ending of the military campaign is and where the beginning of larger reconstruction operations can continue.
Presumably that's partly because you wouldn't have the time. I mean, you can't afford the gap in time, but also presumably because in reality, the winding down of the war and the winding up of stabilization efforts are mutually dependent, and it would have to, right?
Right. So you asked me what the relationship was between stabilization and the political process, and that is it's an obvious one. And then again, how we do the stabilization will be linked to what that outcome is. Do we want a negotiated settlement? Are we waiting for elections to occur at this period of time? We have found in our experiences across the globe that sequencing does matter. So that, for example, having the exchange of prisoners, for example, in one location should precede elections that come from a negotiated settlement. Right? We have found that demobilizing and demilitarizing armed actors can come after, but that process should also be, the planning of that process should be going on now, right? We should be identifying now who are the armed groups that are more amenable to be giving up their arms or reintegrated than other ones are. We use the word reconcilables in Iraq. It was like the Iraqis that used this word, the reconcilables and the non-reconcilables. And the reconcilables were the ones that integratable. And then you can be far more nuanced in where you can target your aid. And I keep going back to, stabilization assistance. But this is a targeted approach. It's a disciplined approach. And it's one that's going to be in pockets of the country.
We're going to start taking questions in just a second. So if you have a question, please go to the microphones on either side and queue up. And while people are doing that, let me just say, or get your reaction to this. I mean, presumably the number, I love the phrase reconcilables and irreconcilables, but presumably the estimated number of reconcilables versus irreconcilables changes over time. As stabilization improves, presumably people who were irreconcilable become, reconcilable. And in other words, that you get a virtuous circle going on here. Is there a track record of that that we build on? How do you factor that in?
Each country would be different based on what the local conditions are, based on what the role of those militias are in relation to each locality. My understanding is that in Yemen, there's close to 1 million armed actors throughout the country. So there's a significant number there. And then you'd have to be talking about I go back to Iraq, who was there before the Civil War started, who emerged during the Civil War, who is now linked to the new war economies, and it can go on and on and on. So our Bureau, again, does this type of specific work. We've done this in Libya, we've done this in Yemen, in other places, where we're identifying the motives, the intentions, the leverage of all of these groups, and who are the ones that can be reconcilable over time. That goes back into the larger security sector stabilization that we specialize in.
If I may comment on the concept of filling the gap, and I think you're absolutely right. We cannot wait until the war is over to start filling the gap. And I'll give you an example, for instance, of the Massam project that Saudi Arabia is running on demining. Demining is important not only from an operational point of view, but also to allow the movement of goods, of aid, but also mobility of people. That's, again, the normalization of life. And it's happening right now in aspects of Hodeidah as the operations was continuing. So you cannot wait until it is over to try and do that. So just to add to your point.
That's terrific. Okay, let's begin with questioning. We have 2 people over here, so that's not a problem. There is another mic over there if anybody else is interested in joining the queue. Go ahead, Beth.
Hi, Elizabeth Dickinson with International Crisis Group. I have 2 brief questions. Thank you both very much again for your comments. The first one is, talking about pockets of stability. I just wanted to ask about sort of the broader standing political contentiousness of regionalism in Yemen. This has traditionally been sort of one of the political issues that has torn apart the fabric at times or brought people together in different ways. But I wonder, how do you think about creating these pockets of stability without inadvertently exacerbating some of the regional divisions within the country. Secondly, again, very briefly, is the war economy, and I wonder how that fits into the stabilization picture. It's been such an important part of perpetuating the conflict. Do we think about stabilization as part of unwinding that war economy, or is really is stabilization more important to sort of really keep the cash flowing in a way, to keep livelihoods, intact as much as possible? So perhaps that's for later on. I would love to hear your thoughts on sort of that.
Great questions. Do you want to take the second one, the war economy, first, and then talk about exacerbating fragmentation in the country? I don't know. It's up to you.
Thank you. Well, I'll talk about, I think they're both related, but let me get to the pockets of stability. Yes, it's difficult. So we're not talking about creating a situation where we can completely engage in all aspects of stabilization initially. I would say first we start small scale. Yes, there can be potential where regional actors or local actors can take advantage of this. That's why how we do it matters. You can always move up and enhance what you're doing in these areas, but if you find, I go back to the locally legitimate actors or the locally legitimate structures that need to be in place beforehand, that can come over time. So if those basic requisites are not there, then this is not going to be an area that's going to be likely candidate for stabilization assistance. It's just not. It's the way that it is. The second part, to the war economy, my understanding, and this is again across different regions of the world, is there are war entrepreneurs, for lack of a better word, that have emerged in all of these locations, and they're likely not going to go away after either. So to the extent to which they can exert leverage and become one of these locally legitimate actors, and who we decide to work with matters. So that, I'll be blunt, I don't see the war economies going away until you start getting into the types of entrepreneurial activities that has been discussed, and that's again longer term. Based on the definition of stabilization that I have been using, which is actually a limited one, it's setting the conditions in place where locally legitimate actors can manage conflict. That kind of activity would probably still continue.
Elizabeth, thank you. Your question is very smart in a sense, but it's also hypothetical in a sense. It's like you're in an ER room and you have to save this person's life. And you have to think, if I save him, is he going to go out and kill other people? So I shouldn't be saving his life right now. War economy is part of any war. And again, the concept of a possible regionalization is a political outcome and can be solved from a political point of view later on. But I think if you say, I will not serve those people, I will not sustain the peace now, I will not stabilize, because I fear that there is a possible, I don't think that's a way of thinking, especially in that. So I am in favor of doing stabilization, even if it was a pocket, even if, one way or another, it leads to something that undesirable outcome. But I think the responsibility to people at that point of time was that.
Great. We'll go to the next question.
Okay, my name is Ahmed. I'm a senior here. And my question is about when you think about GCC actors and their efforts in reconstruction, always think about Saudi and the UAE. But I feel like Qatar is eliminated from the discussions. And after the blockade, people, Qatar started like aligning more with Iran and so on. So, and the role of Qatari maybe government, but the agencies like the media, they're always portraying the UAE and Saudi as a main contributors of the war and the humanitarian crisis, not someone who's sending aid and so on. So I'm interested to know how can the GCC actors, including Qatar, can coordinate their efforts together, or maybe if they're gonna allow Qatari NGOs and so on to contribute to reconstruction.
I think that's for you, Mohammed.
Well, I think all hands to the pump, so to speak. We've heard Stephen in the first session was talking about some sort of a reconstruction authority that would govern how that has been done. I think Yemen would require a lot of work and assistance and help and even investment from everyone. To what extent that is going to be traded for some sort of opposition, or that's a different issue. I don't think we should be thinking about it at this point of time. What everyone is thinking about is identifying the needs, how to deliver those needs, and creating a mechanism for that delivery. And I don't think that if someone is willing to help, Yemen, and you've talked about Qatar, I would talk about Iran as well. Why shouldn't be Iran helping? Finding the right mechanism to allow anyone who would like to help in the right place is going to be a question for the Yemeni government, for the coalition, for the Quad, for all of the other parties, including the UN and the US.
We have two open microphones, so if you'd like to ask a question, please do it. Let me continue the conversation by asking Denise, picking up on that, how does your office and related offices in the United States view working with international partners, with other countries, with allies in these regional situations? Because you talked a lot about working within the government, relations with the DoD, relations between different parts of state, et cetera. But what about U.S. government's how do you view cooperation with friendly foreign governments?
I'll go back to the Stabilization Assistance Review, and one of the key takeaways of this roadmap is that we have burden sharing. And burden sharing is not only the division of labor within the U.S. government in the interagency, but it's burden sharing with our regional partners and our international allies. And that includes, obviously, the Yemen conflict or the Yemen efforts to realize peace, but we have done this across with our Stabilization Leaders Forum, as I mentioned earlier. So we work hand in glove with the UK Stabilization Unit. That would be our counterpart or similar organization. The United Nations, parts of the World Bank that are involved in some of the works that we do as well. Denmark and Germany and France, these are all some of the members of our Stabilization Leaders Forum. And then there's a private company partnership as well that we're enhancing. There's an NGO, international NGOs that we're working with as part of the Resolve network. So this is, in fact, when we're looking at where we get involved or where we're likely to have success, the burden-sharing international partnership is actually essential to how we calculate where we're going to be.
Excellent. All right. Well, we'll go over here to this microphone, which now is being...
Jonathan James again. I don't think there's been quite enough controversy this morning, so I'll throw a hand grenade into the auditorium. If you were wishing to serve the cause of post-conflict stability and reconstruction, could I ask Lise, who's not here any longer, but perhaps you two in her place, would you be better served by a unified central government or by stronger government at provincial level? In other words, a unified or secessionist model of national government?
That's a version of Elizabeth's first question as well, about fragmentation versus national integration. So do either of you want to comment on that?
I will tell you that, for instance, the move in the central bank happened for operational problems. It didn't happen because there was a cessation between the south or the north. It was a move that was mandated by what was happening at that point of time. There was a problem with cash flow. There was a problem with where was the money going, and that necessitated it. It might not have been the wisest move, but it was a necessary move at that point of time. Is it the way forward? I don't think so. I think for any central government, strong or weak, monetary policy and structure has to be in one place. You cannot have it in two places. But again, that is something that I'm sure the Yemeni factions are going to be discussing right now in Stockholm.
Would you care to?
I want to comment as well. In terms of the way that we would approach stabilization, as I indicated before, we do link that to our clear political objectives and our national interests.
Right.
And this applies to any other country working on stabilization. Deputy Assistant Secretary Lenderking indicated clearly U.S. objectives in Yemen, which are to support the legitimate government of Yemen, a unified, stable, and sovereign government of Yemen. So our stabilization approach and policy is linked to our political objectives and our policy outcomes.
Good.
Steve Sesh, thank you both for your comments and your insights. Pursuing the idea of what do we do with 1 million individuals under arms at the end of a conflict, and how do we minimize the threat they pose to stability, is there experience that suggests they can be integrated into existing or forming security forces, either, say, local police forces, or either a national army under the command of individuals who may be able to be plucked from certain militias themselves, but have experience as commanders and therefore could kind of have that ability, the authority that would be needed to be leadership cadre under which these militias or individuals anyway could be somehow comprised?
Our bureau, CSO, does a lot of work in DDR. It depends where it didn't work. For example, in Afghanistan, where there was a program of trying to reintegrate some of the many militias into the Afghan National Army, but it was capped at 10%, so that there was still a significant amount of remaining members of the militias that just still needed jobs. So the reintegration part is reintegration into society, reintegration also back into a national army, right? And as Hussein and I were speaking last night, one of the core of this problem that you're talking about is that whether Yemen, Syria, Iraq, Libya, wherever we may talk about, where states have not broken up, they've broken down. And when you have a situation where a state has broken down, then you have a central authority whose reach cannot extend, so that this is where we're having all of these proliferation of militia. We've had some experiences, CSO, some successes in places like Niger, for example, where they actually are starting a DDR program. And when we often hear people will never give up their arms, they actually have been cases where that is starting. But it's clearly tied to jobs. It's clearly tied to a program where there's an alternative source of revenues for these groups. And this is a very important challenge.
In the conflict in Yemen is actually different conflicts in different parts of the country, or at least, let's say, the challenges to the government come in very different forms. For example, the Houthis have one kind of challenge, Al-Qaeda is another kind of challenge, pockets of Daesh is another kind of challenge. So they're not all the same. So to what extent does stabilization have to vary greatly, even within the same country? I mean, never mind fragmentation and what you want and all that, but the reality is that there are different groups that need to be dealt with differently, and different wars within the same conflict. How do you factor that into planning? And I ask that to both of you.
If I may, I would like to also address Stephen's point. I think it's an important issue to look at examples, and I think that's what you've been calling for. On one level, there is the local security. And I think what we've seen as, let's say, the elite forces in either Hadramaut or in Shabwa can be the basis of a local security force. But in other experiments, and I think that's closer to what the UAE, for instance, with internal security has got. The police force in Dubai or Abu Dhabi is funded by the Emirate itself. There are other Emirates who depend on the federal government for assistance. And I think we could see something like that, depending on the type of threat, on the region's ability to fund its own security forces. Another example is the National Guard, as we've seen in Saudi Arabia, and that could be a different type of force that looks at internal issues when required. So these are, but I think the most important aspect to think about, yes, Yemen is different from other areas, at least in the Arab world, where carrying a weapon is part of the character of most of, not all of Yemen, but most of Yemen. There is also the experiment of political parties owning weapons. So it's not an individual owner of a weapon, as a person like Hussein having his AK-47. It's a group of the political party that has got weapons, and they can use that. And that's the experiment we've seen with Hezbollah. That's the experiment we've seen with the Popular Mobilization Forces in Iraq and in others. That is the element that need to be seen as a part of the regional or even international approach to Yemen. And I'm not talking about the Houthis alone. I'm also talking about, the Islah or even the STC. Any group, any political group who would like to participate in the political process should not have, an armed militia that is, used to sway. And I think if we want to look at the security, restructuring, that is an important element by which we should look at it.
About them, I'm going to go back to your question about the negotiated settlements locally.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to.
So the way that we would approach it is understanding that we're going to target our assistance, we're going to link the assistance to clear political objectives. You would certainly have different strategies or different objectives in certain parts of the country that have fundamentally different conflicts or actors or regional partners. So yes, the answer to your question is yes. This is at a subnational level. It's at a local level, finding different local partners in different areas, but that doesn't still undermine the fact that we tie this to a political objective that recognizes the legitimate government of Yemen, but yet tries to negotiate these settlements at very local levels with different local actors.
So presumably it's precisely because there is a desired political outcome tied to both stabilization and humanitarian work that you would have to take that the different actors centrally into consideration at the very beginning of planning, right?
This is, this is the way that we have approached this in our stabilization assistance review. This is based on the lessons that we have learned or identified, I hope we've learned, from Afghanistan and Iraq and other places.
One size does definitely not fit all, right?
Right.
Okay, so we've got two questions here, and why don't we take them both, and then they'll answer them, and that will be the end of the panel. So go right ahead. First question, then second question.
So one thing that hasn't really been mentioned very much so far is that, what's been happening with prisons in Yemen and detention facilities. So in terms of problems either with the transfer of jurisdiction over detention facilities, or the kind of allegations of rape, torture, and abuse which have been happening in prisons across Yemen. So I was wondering what the panel think, either whether this is more of a long-term issue rather than an immediate issue like getting electricity and water and healthcare, but how the prison systems can be worked to make sure that they are not undermining the long-term stability of the country.
Okay, good. And the second question?
My question just relates to the general nature of private military companies in the conflict. As looking at Iraq and Afghanistan, they were not always beneficial, and I was just wondering if you could touch on their role.
Okay, so we've got prison and stabilization, prisons and prisoners and stabilization, and we've got private contractors, military personnel.
I'll take the first question, if you'd like. I think what you're talking about is part of what we call the transitional justice. So once the resolution is being achieved, I think people would look at all of that. But a reminder is that what you're talking about has been happening at time of war. And in times of war, you cannot apply all of the procedures that you would expect under war. You'd get sort of different type of martial laws, people doing things possibly not right, but it's being usually judged by what is required. But definitely transitional justice is an important part of any reconciliation, and I think that is going to be considered as part of that stabilization on the future. Now, again, I would like to go back to my analogy of the ER room. That's what stabilization is all about. This is an interim, immediate attention given to specific objectives, and it does not replace the long-term objectives of a political process.
And the Stockholm process may, insofar as it is implemented at all, may begin with a prisoner exchange, which suggests the centrality of it to even a ceasefire, if that were ever to happen. But either of those issues, or both, if you would care to address.
I can't comment on private military contractors in Yemen, but I can comment on the fact that at the end of the day, or where we're starting, are there locally legitimate actors and with which we can work with, or which we can identify who can provide the security so that we can then engage in larger operations. So at the end of the day, if you don't have the legitimate local actors or structures in place, that's the key variable for moving forward.
Great. Well, please join me in thanking our panelists, Mohammed, Baharoon, Denise, Natali, and the absent Lise, Grande. Thank you very much. And I guess